and lessons learned and things like that. And so it's having these sessions, consultative sessions with people on subjects related to lessons from COVID. So earlier today, there was a discussion on certain COVID and climate related issues. And this afternoon, what we have is a sort of discussion on climate governance and how you can milestone it. And this is a recorded discussion. It will be published subsequently once it's edited. And I assume I have everyone's consent to record and do so. I mean, that's the GI requirement. And but I just wanted to say it's informal, right? This is as if we were sitting at the JI table in Islamabad and me just asking you some questions about this because there's a report that we need to get out later on. But it is being recorded and it will be put onto social media afterwards. But nevertheless, it will be informal. Now, I had reached out to Imran and Sarah, but Rimal, I didn't have your number, so I couldn't get in touch with you. I'm sorry. But what I had done is I had asked Imran and Sarah to sort of prepare a statement of sorts, sort of their thoughts on the issue. And I'm sure you have plenty to say. What I'd really like to hear about is the sort of intersect between climate change and human rights. But since we haven't discussed this, I thought maybe I could ask you third, and you could respond with some thoughts at that point. And then after that, I'll start asking questions and fleshing out some of the thoughts and ideas that you've put out. So that's
Sounds
the
like a
plan.
plan.
Everything great? All right, super. So welcome everyone to a Jinnah Institute panel discussion on how can climate governance be mainstream. We're joined by Imran Khalid of STPI, Rimal Mohyuddin of Amnesty International, and Sarah Hayat, who is a lawyer and a climate lawyer based in Lahore and Islamabad. Welcome everyone. So let's start with Imran Khalid. Will you tell us some of your thoughts about climate governance and milestoning it after the COVID pandemic?
Thank you, Rafi. It's a pleasure to be here. I did prepare a few slides, and if I could, would it be possible to share the screen? Let's see. Just give me a
That's good. There are organizers in the ether somewhere, and hopefully they will have heard your voice.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and do this. Application window. Yes. So I've got about 20 slides, and I'll try and go through them quickly within the next 10 minutes or so. Do you have the cover slide discussing climate change amid COVID in front of you? Is this visible?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Rafi, just give me a heads up if I'm going, at the 8-minute mark. I'd appreciate it. Yeah. So when we talk about COVID, the pandemic that we're facing, there's always been a warning about pandemics that's been there, but has it been visible to those of us who are not working in the field? So here is a tweet by the Discover Society, only from August of last year. The threat of global pandemics is a pressing concern, yet there is no widespread public awareness of the issue. I tried to look this up, and I found dozens and dozens of tweets talking about the pandemics and how they might be affecting us in the future, but apparently we had not been giving them some heed. This is something from the CDC of the US, talking about, it was posted on the 100-year anniversary of the 1918 global flu pandemic. And here they're really talking about their preparations.
I saw slides move forward. We're still on the first slide.
Okay, I think we might be having some kind of a delay. Has it shown up yet or no?
Not yet.
Okay, so let me just stop sharing it, and I'll quickly go through
There it is. We have the CDC slide up now.
Okay. So the CDC slide, it's up there now. They're talking about how they're preparing for the flu pandemics and whether they're prepared or not. But the question that we're trying to ask here is, how prepared are you? Just think of it in light of the climate crisis that we're facing, right? So you're never really prepared enough, is what I'm trying to get at. Do you have Bill Gates in front of you? That's my next slide.
Not yet.
Okay, so it'll come up, and I'll try and keep talking, and then as we move forward, hopefully it'll show up. So my next slide was based on a TED talk given by Bill Gates in 2015. It's titled "The Next Outbreak: We're Not Ready." Despite all the pronouncements in terms of trying to address the needs when it comes to pandemics, what Bill Gates was trying to say here was that we're not ready. And I think this is where we're at in terms of climate change as well. So I'm trying to build a connection between climate change and COVID. There has been a lot of information out there, and to us, especially those of us who work in the field, it's readily available. But to those who are not directly interacting with the science itself, perhaps it's not being thought of in the same fashion as is by us. Did Bill Gates ever show up or not?
He just showed up. So maybe you click one more time.
Yeah, he did. So for the sake of trying to get this thing done in time, I'll just turn off my slides, and we'll just have this discussion without it. I'm sorry. Okay. So you've had this discussion about pandemics that's been happening, but it's never out there in the public domain as is perceived by policy analysts and think tanks and academicians in terms of whether and how should we address this problem. And I think climate change is the same way. So when COVID came into play, we were found lacking in a number of ways. We weren't ready. Every country went into their own shell. People were grasping at the masks and the other personal protection equipment, and it was this whole notion of global cooperation went out the window. And I think climate it's a window into what our future might look like when it comes to climate change. A world which is increasingly warming, and a world where we are not prepared to address not only the mitigation aspects, but also the adaptation aspects. In Pakistan, the 2010 floods were perhaps the first time climate change really hit home in terms of the impacts and the scale of what we might be witnessing in the years and times to come. More recently, the effects of urban flooding in Karachi have hit home in a way that allude to the effects of climate change as they're happening now and as they will continue to happen in the years and decades to come. So there are winners and losers here. Winners are those of us who got the resources to go through it. If we can move out of areas that are getting flooded, we've got the resources to provide food for our family. We've got the resources to handle the heat waves that are coming in. But then there are the losers. And here it's a social justice issue. Losers are majority of the world's population who do not have the resources and are going to be impacted by it most. So climate change is first and foremost a social justice issue for me. The small island states, the residents of which can attest to it. In Pakistan, we are facing climate change like in perhaps rarely in any other country. From glacial lake outburst floods in the north to sea level rise in the coastal areas, to locust attacks, which have also been affected by climate change. So it's here, it's happening. Whether we like it or not, we'll have to deal with it. Now, in terms of the cost, according to the United Nations, approximately $280 billion to $500 billion a year will be needed by 2050 in terms of adapting to the cost of climate change, and that's only for developing countries. Just as a comparison, the 2010 floods cost us anywhere between 14 to 18 billion dollars. So where does that leave us here in Pakistan, a country that is not only coming to terms with the demon of climate change, but also trying to invest in coal, for example, under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, trying to develop in the same manner as those countries that have contributed to climate change. And there's a dichotomy here that needs to be addressed. In terms of COVID and the response that came after it, the European Union has taken the biggest step in terms of addressing this issue. They've come up with a green stimulus amounting to $572 billion. China has also announced plans to go carbon neutral by 2060. So these are good steps that can perhaps be heeded to by the likes of the US, likes of India when it comes to mitigation. But at the same time, approximately $700 billion have been invested or are to be invested in carbon-intensive sectors. China itself, even though it's saying it's going to go carbon neutral by 2060, is in the process of investing 214 billion in dirty energy. Indonesia, 86 million. United States, 80 billion. So there is this dichotomy that you can see across the world as well in terms of whether we're going to be able to address this issue or not. So lessons from COVID. Pay attention to the science. The scientists have been telling us for years and years, decades upon decades, about a threat of a new pandemic, the likes of which we've rarely seen, but we've always set it aside. As to know, we're prepared for it, but as we've seen, no one's really prepared for it. So what's next? And I'll conclude with this. Business as usual will lead to catastrophe. This statement applies not only to Pakistan, but across the world. And business as usual, not only in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation. And we need to rethink our approach to growth. And this is a good step to take, even if you're not talking about climate change. I mean, the way we are growing and the way we are urbanizing and the way we are overreaching, that has impacts on our environment in general as well. So here we need to prioritize areas which are normally considered non-traditional security threats. And I talk about non-traditional security threats here because if it's considered a security threat, the Pakistani government is usually trying to address it. And here, climate change should be part and parcel of that. This is at the policy making, the strategic level, but we need local plans and policies as well. So policies and plans at the district level, at the tehsil level, where local governments are in play, that they're involved in terms of guiding our policy making in response to the threat of climate change. Finally, research in terms of how we're responding to it. This needs to happen across the board. That involves a mechanism that involves academia, think tanks, governmental officials, and research needs to happen at the transboundary level as well, because climate change does not recognize borders. And finally, communicate. This is not happening, especially as we see in Pakistan. You've got the Federal Ministry of Climate Change that might be at odds with the provincial ministries and other related departments. And that needs to change if we are to holistically address the crisis. I'll end here and I look forward to the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Imran. Several good points about the lack of pandemic preparedness, which is also essentially a climate risk going further in the future as well. Um, and there's some issues that I'd like to ask you and speak to you more about, especially your idea about rethinking growth, but we'll come to that later. Maybe I can turn to Sarah at this point and ask you, Sarah, about your thoughts on climate governance and milestones.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you to the Jinnah Institute for organizing us, convening us. Always a pleasure. So I received, Rafi, like about 2 hours ago, some questions from the Jinnah Institute, which seem to indicate that this talk will be about adaptation in light of COVID, climate change
Whatever that
adaptation
means.
in light of COVID. Whatever that means, right? And so that's what I was just getting at. Well, firstly, I want to I just want to lay it out there that there isn't enough information. There just isn't enough grassroots level information in Pakistan, especially or data. Data would be a better word to actually address any specific questions on COVID and its impact, and its sort of link with climate change and how it's impacting any community, and whether it's exacerbating the effects, or so it's mostly just conjecture and perhaps what some literature we have from international forums that we are building on. Secondly, I feel, and this is very personal, that COVID and climate change don't really have any link. I mean, it's just sort of been injected into the discourse for a good reason, which is that when any one of us goes to any gathering, somebody or the other will turn around and say, we've seen tangible impacts of, a lockdown. The air is cleaner. It's easier to breathe. Spring is very nice, prolonged in Lahore. But that really doesn't have much to do with climate change. Air pollution unto itself is not, again, entirely within the ambit of climate change. It's a more environmental issue, and in the Venn diagram, it would just overlap with climate change and environment, like in the center. So, with that said, there are some things, and I will just take like this talk at face value, the topic at face value. So I think it'd be nice to sort of discuss and a little on why climate change and COVID are being linked together. Both of them impact economy substantially within and the economic health of every country. And then within that, the vulnerable communities get impacted inequitably by both COVID and climate change. COVID has disrupted life as we see it, something climate change is also going to do. And then COVID has insisted that there'd be, and Imran also spoke a little about this, that there'd be transnational collaboration between countries in order to cope with something at this large a scale, a pandemic of sorts. But in my mind, I think barring these factors and the fact that, yes, mental health is, again, very disturbed by both climate change and COVID, I don't think there's much of a link between them. The biggest difference is, I feel that COVID has an end in sight, like most pandemics do, and when a vaccine comes out and is easily accessible, the pandemic will be behind us. Whereas climate change is going to continue rolling and has been for a while. And nobody really took it seriously then. And now for those of us who work in this area, you see that most of the funding that was reserved for climate change has now been redirected to COVID. And I speak for government, I speak for international organizations, private entities, like the investment is, the research is going towards towards figuring out how the pandemic should be dealt with, how what impacts it will have, the future impacts of the pandemic, how we can deal with any pandemics that might arise. Rafi, we lost you there in the middle, but I basically just said that the biggest difference between both climate change and COVID, at least in my mind, is that COVID has an end in sight. Once the vaccine is out and easily accessible, COVID will end, whereas climate change is rolling. has been for a while. Nobody cared about it then, nobody's caring about it now. And the worst part is that for those of us working in this area, we're seeing a lot of the funds are being channeled towards COVID and away from climate change. The same way that and then climate change is sort of falling lower on the hierarchy of priorities for governments and even for institutions that were otherwise taking it quite seriously. And that said, adaptation within Pakistan, and I would love to discuss this more with the learned panel here. But like, I don't see any like serious adaptation measures undertaken in Pakistan, especially at a grassroots level. We've got a good policy that, and it, I mean, maybe a little outdated, needs to be definitely revisited. But I don't see any tangible effects. So, I mean, disaster relief management and climate change adaptation aren't necessarily the same thing. So if the government has done something in the wake of floods or cyclones, that isn't necessarily a climate change adaptation measure that's been put into force or effect. So I don't know how COVID will impact or influence, or this pandemic will influence climate change adaptation in the country, because we are a little lost on what the measures in play already are, and if there are any, so to speak. But what we can, I think, discuss here and we give credit where credit is due is that the government has introduced a green stimulus package and has sought to create green jobs. And of course, this is very much a personal opinion, but I do feel that it is from their part a bona fide attempt to combat climate change. Of course, one that is open to discussion, whether planting trees and creating jobs in just for planting trees is the best way of going about it. I hope we will discuss it later. But Pakistan has done this. They have invested heavily in it. The 10 billion tree tsunami, and as part of it, jobs are being created for the youth. And then there is a strong correlation between COVID, climate change, and the youth. The youth is the future. The youth needs to act more to combat climate change. And the youth can at this point undertake more jobs than some senior people, as they are more vulnerable to COVID, and thereby help the economy. So there is a link there, there's a circular link there. Apart from the green jobs created planting trees, something else that we can also talk about is the green stimulus package, the economic relief that has been provided during lockdown to vulnerable people, economically marginalized people, something that was necessary, more necessary than I think we can put into words. But my point here is, in a climate change context, that climate change is on a daily basis taking away livelihood, health, and pretty much the only income stream some people have, like women, for example, most women have limited skill sets in rural areas, and climate change isn't allowing agriculture to flourish. It's killing livestock, it's diminished fisheries. Why shouldn't there be a continuous stream of economic relief for these people who are impacted by climate change? A phenomenon, and I'm going to be bold for saying this, much larger than COVID is. Climate change because COVID, and I think that I'll explain this a little more. Like, COVID has upset us so much because we don't understand it. We don't understand its impacts, what it's going to do to our bodies, what organs it'll affect, how we can control it or whatever. And the same is true for climate change. So people don't realize it, like some of the impacts of climate change are organic, and some of them are coming through in areas which we can't fathom. They are so unprecedented, they are so unexpected, and which makes climate change, at least in my head, and because they will be at a larger scale and at a rolling scale, I think climate change becomes a much larger threat in my head, at least for the time being. So yeah, that said, and in the end, I'd like to, and I think at least this is what I thought of in the last 2 hours that I've been thinking about this since I received the questions. I think an area that could link climate change, COVID, and adaptation is green agriculture, climate change sensitive agriculture. We felt the impacts of COVID on food supply, food supply and food demand as well, very drastically. Something climate change also impacts with great intensity. So if there has to be a policy or an adaptation measure that has to link COVID and climate change, and that has to come into effect, especially in a country like Pakistan, I think it should focus more on the agricultural side of things. Sustainable agriculture, resilient seeds, climate resilient seeds. The youth should be trained more in sort of undertaking water conserving agricultural practices. They should be women should be engaged, trained more in undertaking agricultural practices that are going to be sustainable in the long term. And apart from that, I can't think of anything else that could link COVID and climate change as far as climate adaptation policies go. And of course, then you have investing in green infrastructure. You have that's something that all countries should undertake regardless. And another thing I do want to say is that Imran Khalid Saab here said that countries like China, they have even when COVID was sort of picking up in its intensity, China said that they will, to revive their economy, for example, invest very heavily in eco-friendly infrastructure development. I mean, that is, and the same holds true for Pakistan. I mean, we have been focusing a lot on cement and steel to sort of, and we never shut down those industries to begin with because we wanted to keep the economy afloat at some level. It's counterproductive. China saying it's going to go carbon neutral by 2060, and yet investing in infrastructure is counterproductive. And if their means of recovery from the financial crisis is going to be all about construction and infrastructure development and construction that's not going to be green savvy, it's counterproductive. The whole thing is borderline hypocritical. Same for Pakistan. If you are just planting trees and that is your COVID and climate change mitigation strategy, but you are investing heavily in steel and in cement, and renewables are nowhere on your mind, and it's all counterproductive. It's all a facade, really. It just doesn't work. Your tree plantation gets vetoed out unless you have substantial adaptation mechanisms and mitigation mechanisms in force. And I think that'll be it. Rafi, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very comprehensive reply. Even though you claim that you got these questions.
No, it's something that's been bothering me. I see too much talk about COVID and climate change, and I can't relate to it. I don't get it.
We seem to have lost Rimmel. I was also having some internet connection, so I hope she'll be able to join us again. There are two things that I wanted to flag, and maybe we can talk about until Rimmel joins us again. The first is both of you, Khalid, yourself, you said that, we're not prepared enough for pandemics. We don't have any information about pandemics and how they are spread, especially here in Pakistan. There's absolutely no research whatsoever. And Sarah, you were also saying that there's no data on connecting COVID to climate change. In an earlier panel discussion, Hassan Sipra was speaking about how there's almost no local data about how climate change is going to impact different ecosystems or areas in Pakistan. And it sort of seems that we're getting ahead of ourselves by talking about climate governance and things, when in fact we don't even have some of the basic information about making policy. So thank you, Rimmel. I know you were having connection problems, so I'll just turn to you and ask a question just midway here. Maybe I can ask you both just quickly to sort of, what sort of data do you think would be important to better frame climate policy in Pakistan? Localized data, what granularity? I know, Sarah, you were talking about women and you were talking about empowerment, and these are great examples. Maybe you could expand on some of those. but what would be the areas of data collection or policy analysis that could give us a better localized understanding of climate impacts so that governance in those areas at least could be improved?
Thank you so much, Rafe, and thank you, Sarah and Imran Saab. This was, I'm so happy that human rights is actually it's a dimension that's actually being included in a conversation around this. And I think that, Rafe, I saw earlier today on the panel that you said that one of the reasons why smart lockdowns was successful to the degree that they apparently have been is because of the local knowledge. So nobody can disregard the importance of having a local vocabulary explain to people in terms that they understand. It's a project that Sarah and I have actually been working on, which is actually developing that, if I go to a farmer tomorrow and I tell him emissions are on the rise, he doesn't know what emissions are. I try to translate it for him in Urdu. What can I possibly say that will adequately convey the horror of the situation? Bearing in mind, and as Sarah was saying, that, just to sort of deviate from your question slightly, when Sarah was saying that, the links, that the connection between COVID and the climate crisis is quite superficial, I think that's actually a really valid point, and it sort of speaks to the identity crisis that climate change has when it comes to how it's communicated. Imran Saab was speaking about how the way that, academics and environmentalists understand climate change. It's, we have access to knowledge, or we understand it in terms that are not probably available to a person who has a very superficial understanding of what climate change is. And therein lies the problem. The reason why I think the climate crisis actually latched on to the discourse that was sort of being developed around COVID, which was that, it's a problem that affects everybody, that humans are responsible, and that, the states need to look in. States started turning inwards when they had to actually cooperate. Economic recovery packages were supposed to focus on these things. Because the climate crisis has been so poorly understood and so scientifically communicated, it has failed to create that level of panic that it should. And unfortunately, as Sarah was saying, that it is something that affects people on a much more deep-rooted level. We've seen, so just taking the example of Pakistan, when it came to the smog crisis, comes to the smog crisis, one of the reasons why that problem gathered so much public attention was because it was everywhere. It was ubiquitous. Nobody could ignore it, and it affected everybody in a very personal way. So it was easy to get people's attention about it and have enough people actually raise questions. The climate crisis and COVID does the same thing. The COVID actually forced everybody to go home. Everybody had to wear a mask. Everybody was sort of, told, and there's nobody on the planet who hasn't been affected by it. Climate crisis, because of the way that it's easier for people who are in a certain position of strength or power or have the money, they can avoid it. And it's easy for them to ignore it. Even when the floods were happening in Karachi and our news feeds were flooded with images, it was easy for people sitting outside Karachi to get over it and pretend like it didn't happen and just sort of like move beyond it. And that, I think, boils down to how in Pakistan, and in fact, the broader discourse around climate change in general is so north-focused. Even within Amnesty, the policies that are being developed and Amnesty's foray into climate change, which traditionally wouldn't take up as a cause, is very north-focused. It sort of keeps, and countries like from the global south, which happen to be the most affected, are left out of that conversation simply because it's very difficult for them to generate that kind of political will that's required to actually prioritize it as something to the level that it needs to be prioritized. Our economy is entirely dependent on agriculture, and we are in a situation, we've put ourselves in a position where the people who are being the most affected by it are characterizing it as Allah ki marzi, God's will. Barishein salis ab aayi hain, flooding ye ho gayi hai. So it's sort of not being ingrained to them that this is the climate crisis. Even when you translate climate crisis, it's called Mauliyati Tabdili, which does not I mean, what is that? What is that to somebody who has never heard of this? I come from a certain level of privilege, and it still takes me 7 years to understand some of the most basic concepts about climate change. And I think that's where so if before we sort of jump into the kind of local data points we need, I think more than anything we need to start from the very basics. A local vocabulary that is everywhere, that is accessible. I know that there are some organizations in Islamabad that have, I believe, lead Pakistan tried to develop some collateral for children, but again, it's sort of relegated to very limited spaces, and that I think is something that I think a huge aspect of an unaddressed aspect of the issue at hand. And I think sort of going back to what Imran Saab was saying in terms of the reason why COVID was able to very quickly take away funding, take away attention, because 2019 was actually a seminal year for climate change campaigning, with the climate strikes happening in Pakistan, due to the work of Climate Action PK and local activists. We had a moment where there were people out on the streets by the dozens. You had the Greta Thunberg effect. You had people actually, after years and years of work, there was a moment and it got completely sort of swept away. And that speaks to the ease with which people can be distracted from this issue because of how poorly understood it is. And in that respect, obviously we've seen, in the US, Brazil, China, they've used this COVID-induced distraction to roll back on so many environmental gains that had been made. We've seen it's and COP26 getting delayed. None of these things, I think it's just as the climate change community, before it starts focusing on, like the global south is so far behind in even becoming a part of that conversation. And that I think can only happen if enough people sort of understand it in their lived experiences. Because, there are people in this country who are in Thar, living next to the coal power plant, who can speak to the effects of climate change in ways that none of us can possibly, no matter how much training and how much experience and how much academic understanding we have of it, but they can't speak about it in a language that would be accepted or understood in the climate change community. So I would start there.
Very valid point that there is a hegemonic climate cultural identity which is created in the north. You've got your bad guys, the big oil and drilling companies. You've got mitigation as your plan, and there's money to be made as long as the right stimulus package is there. That's the sort of meta narrative, which is very different from the concerns of the vast majority of people on earth in the global south. Is a completely ignored discourse. And whilst I completely agree that we need to listen to people in Thar, get that local discourse, listen to them and listen to what they're saying and how they're saying it, and to drive a sort of climate narrative from that, a narrative that could be linked to other countries in the global south to create a more powerful and profound climate message. But I still think we are without data and information to make policy. And so I'm still going to turn to Sarah and Imran and ask them again, what types of information or what systems are we missing in our current sort of setup with respect to climate change that isn't giving us the right sort of, the basis to make decisions? As Rimal says, we have this discourse on climate change, which is English, it's Western oriented, and it's in development speak. We need to have a different type of discourse. So what types of areas do you think we're missing in the climate policy space in Pakistan right now that you think could be better filled with better information? Sarah, why don't you go first?
All right, sure. Rafi, I think, well, to begin with, I think Rimal answered the basic to this. She laid the foundation to this question, because no matter what policy you inject, without awareness, it's down the drain. And we've seen it. Like, we have seen it with our eyes. You and I have seen it. We are working on. We've interacted with the average person who knows nothing about climate change. No policy is going to be effective unless that person understands climate change. That's the first part, which is, and so I must stress on what Rimal here has said, which is that you need your narrative, you need it in your vernacular, you need the average person to feel connected to climate change. You need to disconnect you and me, or somebody living behind in a gated society. You need to make them feel more connected to climate change. So basically, it narrows down to awareness. That said, I think something that does link in with this is that, let's say we have strong policies, right? Let's say we have glaring evidence. You and I go and we collect data. Will the politicians put it into effect? COVID was the prime example for it. And I myself am linking COVID to climate change here, but a lot of countries were given first-hand data and information saying, look, COVID is killing people, you need to go into lockdown. And lots of countries didn't opt to, like Pakistan initially. So whatever policy we actually have has to be a bridge between saving our economy and controlling or combating climate change. Because no politician, no government is going to adopt any policy that jeopardizes economic health or economic GDP, or however you want to term it. So when we are collecting grassroots level data, and I've seen it even in my own work, even if you give very fancy, let's say, if you give very fancy sort of options to policymakers, you can do X, Y, and Z in a certain area. It doesn't settle with them, because what they want is a policy, a climate change adaptation policy that allows the average person to generate income as well. So all our policies, all our data, technically, if this is what it's going to take to get the government on board and to get them to actually sort of give effect to these policies, then we need to have our climate change adaptation should be such that we're saving lives, but we're also generating money in the process. And that said, climate change data, climate change adaptation policies, climate change, whatever, laws, rules, regulations, for Pakistan at least, should vary from locality to locality, not even province to province, locality to locality. Local government is very important here because our demographics are different, our geography is different, our topography is different. The impacts of climate change in Sindh, not the same in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Punjab is suffering on an agricultural front from climate change. Balochistan has different issues from climate change. So all of it has to be very sort of localized. Whatever affects, all data gathered has to be localized. All policies have to be localized. Of course, because I niche in this area, I do want to stress there that data on climate change in women is desperately needed. We desperately need more policies on this area, not just at the grassroots level, but we need more women involved in making policies for climate change adaptation. And yeah, so and like, if you ask me about collecting data can only be collected on ground. We can't sit in Islamabad, we cannot sit in federal ministries, we can't sit in air-conditioned rooms and know what climate change is doing to people in different parts of the country. You have to go there firsthand, talk to them, explain to them first what climate change is, and then gather enough information to actually put together a valid policy that will have some impact.
Thank you. Imran, do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I'll just build up on what Sarah has just said. So, to me, there are three areas that we can start off. I mean, there's so much research needed in this realm that we can go on and on. But the three areas that I would really like us to focus on. So there's the science of climate change and how it's impacting us. So how are the monsoons being impacted? affected, if the monsoons are being altered, and to what extent, right? So we need to have. So I'll talk about what we need, and then I'll also say what kind of researchers we need. So we need modelers, we need physicists, we need climatologists who can really get to the heart of the problem. At this time, a lot of our research is being done at universities, at GCISC, which is the Global Change Impact Studies Center. But I think, and as good a work as they're doing, I think we need to enhance their capacity as well as build on that by bringing in more resources. So this is the science remains an integral part. I'll talk about the glacial lake outburst floods that are happening. How fast are glaciers melting? I know there are a couple of research projects underway that are looking at the scope and the scale of the melting, and these are longitudinal studies. But we need more and more of that because of the topography and the geography of Pakistan, a country that has the highest peak and starting in the north and in K2 and ending in the south at the Arabian Sea. There's so much diversity, not only culture but also in terms of physiography, and that needs to be understood much better. So how are our deserts being altered? We know that the locust attack that have come about in recent years, that they're linked to climate change as well. But to what extent? So these are some of the things that we really need to get a handle on, and that can only be done here in Pakistan. No study being done somewhere else can be replicated. It won't be able to give us those insights that can be gotten from on-ground research within Pakistan. So science is one. Second is human dimensions, as Sarah mentions. So human dimensions, we're talking about interacting with the communities and individuals who are being impacted by climate change, be it from floods, be it from droughts, heat waves. And here we're not, a lot of researchers now go and talk to individuals, and most of the respondents are male, unfortunately, just because of the concerns that the women might have in terms of talking to an outside person, as well as access. So here, not only we need to bring that gender perspective in, as Sarah said, but also to have female researchers. We need more and more of them to go out there and get data. For example, when we were out in Dera Ghazi Khan researching floods, I had a lot of difficulty talking to females. It's because of the culture and issues that they had. So you need to have individuals who can bridge that gap. So obviously we can talk about longitudinal studies on food security in this regard. Disasters, our response to disasters through NDMAs mainly reactive, and we need to do more research on that. So research can happen in plenty of ways when it comes to this. So we've gotten science, we've got human dimensions, and finally institutions. Institutions, there's an economist, a Nobel Prize winner, Douglas North, who worked on institutions, and he started looking at institutions after he was asked to go and guide developing countries on their economic growth models, and he found that neoclassical economics wasn't the way through, because whatever models were working in the West could not be replicated elsewhere. And so he defined institutions as rules, formal rules and informal rules. So formal rules are your constitution, the laws that we might have, but there are informal rules at play as well. So why is it that Pakistan has had a climate change policy? We've got a water policy, we've got an environmental policy, we've got act after act after act when it comes to these issues, but these aren't being implemented on ground. So why is it that the enforcement is lacking? So we need research on these institutions, not just understanding what's, looking at a policy and saying, look, this is the way forward, but to understand how that policy is perceived by somebody in Quetta or Peshawar, because they're going to perceive the climate change policy in a different manner, which is why after the 18th Amendment, each of the provinces is coming up with their own. But why is that? And are those policies that these individual departments in the provinces, they're coming up with them, or are they in line with the needs of the people in Turbat, for example, or in Dera Ghazi Khan, or in Thar, right? So not only are we talking about researching science, human dimensions, and institutions separately, but then we need to be able to connect them with each other as well, and try and integrate these research questions in such a way that we can come up with that can then go on to inform policy making and decision making at the broader level.
Thank you, Imran. Institutions, human dimensions, and science. Rimla, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to pass an idea past you and see how you respond to that. Since the 19th and 20th century, the world is now divided politically into a model of nation states. And some of these nation states are welfare states, as ours is supposed to be. And welfare states are supposed to provide prosperity to their people. That's what economic development is. That's what every policy, as Sara was saying, every policy has at its core the need to provide economic development to the impoverished people of Pakistan. And so the welfare state is conceived in this way, and the formal documents of the state, the constitution, would provide its citizens with fundamental rights within this opportunity to have prosperity. The right to political participation, religious freedom, freedom from torture, freedom of expression, and so on. But it seems to me, and human rights organizations have, because now these things were written constitutions, human rights organizations have helped civil society develop discourses separately in different regions, in different countries, which mean sometimes very context-specific discourses on these types of political and human rights. But it seems to me that this welfare state model doesn't contain in it a protection of ecological balance as a fundamental responsibility of the state. It was never part of the problem when the idea was being thought up, so to speak. And so this idea of linking climate impacts to human rights it has been getting lots of momentum recently. It's also, in my opinion, a great way to get the voice of the southern sort of representation heard at some places. Now, what sorts of steps have organizations taken to develop discourses, for example, the discourse on women's rights in other countries? What lessons can be learned from them in places like Pakistan, where a new climate discourse linking climate change to human rights and fundamental rights is desperately needed?
I think that's a fantastic question, Rafi, because contrary to what people think about human rights, there is I think within please, I'm saying this in the presence of lawyers, so please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that that in the Constitution of Pakistan, there is a right to food. And I think there is a right to a safe and healthy environment. And I believe that that's something that international law is also taking more cognizance of, where the right to air is being recognized slowly, but through statements from the special rapporteurs. And hopefully we'll see it being enshrined in different international legal standards. But having said that, I think the most important lessons that can be derived from the human rights community for the climate crisis community, which should, as you correctly pointed out, should be linked, because of course it is a human rights challenge. And I think it's something that Amnesty internally struggled a lot with as well, because how do we use the same level of urgency for a problem that's a slow burn? We've seen, I'm sure all of you, since we've been in school, we've been hearing climate change, and greenhouse gases, global warming, and obviously we've seen terrible things happen, but we're still standing. So it's hard to keep convincing people that this is such a massive emergency and you need to sort of really get on it, or otherwise something terrible will happen. And then something terrible happens, but at such a distance that it's very easy to disassociate. It's not like, it's a very crowded space in Pakistan when it comes to problems. So I latch on to the smog campaign for this, to answer your question, which is that when smog was unfolding around Pakistan, and even internally Amnesty was like, but what does Amnesty have to say? Like, why would Amnesty speak about this? The fact is, I'm sorry, I just made a comment. The fact is that when we decided to frame the smog crisis as a human rights issue, the effect that it had was it personalized it for people. Because when you think of your human rights being violated, it actually is a much more stressful situation. And then it makes you sort of sit up more and want to know what your call to action can be. How can you participate in reducing this problem? But unfortunately, with the climate crisis, as Sarah was pointing out, it's a crisis with no end in sight. And as a result, one of the biggest reasons why political will is so difficult to garner for climate change is because the solutions and the policies and the research that is so desperately needed, it's going to bear fruit after the next election. It's not going to be something that you convince a politician to invest in renewable energy. They're not going to see the impact of that, maybe even in their lifetime. And nobody wants to win votes on the basis of a future that people can't see and can't immediately benefit from, right? Whereas with human rights, often the violation is immediate. You can instantly point to a villain. You can instantly say, this is the person responsible. This is the person you can write to. This is the person who can make it stop. I think that sort of story around the climate crisis, it's too meta at this point. It's not like I can point to a minister and say this person is responsible, or I can say that these are like, who's the hero, who's the villain. The kind of devices that campaigners have relied on in the past to actually construct that story are unfortunately not available to the climate crisis movement. And that, I think, requires new thinking. It requires us to create a new category. And so what we can borrow from the human rights sort of frameworks is sort of figuring out how to sort of manufacture the urgency, which unfortunately does not organically exist for the climate crisis. You can't just have people like experts who are the science that is required, and I'm listening to the kind of data that we need, but that data is unless you present it in a way that is understandable to everybody, it's not going to sort of catch wind in the way that will lead to people coming out on the streets, and then actually becoming such a hot topic that politicians actually latch onto it. One thing that's really interesting about Pakistan is that they recognize the value of looking active on climate change for global optics. That's why they can't stop harping on about the the billion tree tsunami. They get one video out of the World Economic Forum, and they use that they dine on that for months. And that's exactly what happened with the green jobs that they're creating. Like, look, of course, nobody is like, something is better than nothing, of course. And like, I would rather that this happened than it didn't happen. But at the same time, there's an opportunity here that if they see that this is something that they can sort of, at a time when Pakistan is trying to build its human rights credibility up, it's trying to make itself, it's rehabilitating its image, all of that. So there's an opportunity there for them to sort of see that, okay, you want to build up your human rights credibility. Climate crisis is a human rights issue. Why don't you do more? And so that's kind of where I think human rights organizations have a really important role to play.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And Imran has rightly pointed out, we've also got the SDG Goal Award as well. There were several press conferences about that and a lot of back-patting that went on. I also feel that we're running out, we're not running out of time, but we're sort of rounding up the end of this discussion. So I'd like to sort of ask maybe for a concluding thought or submission from you guys. And just share this as a sort of closing bit from my point of view, that there are, I don't know whether it's opportunities lost or discourses stolen on climate change and climate change stories in Pakistan. But if you take the sort of rain in Karachi that led to the flood, that's a very good opportunity to look at how urban climate crises play out in Pakistan and how they affect municipal governance, how they affect local utilities, how people suffer during an urban flood like this, not just lives but businesses, and how it seemed to me like a opportunity to be able to understand and better describe how climate change impacts Pakistan. And instead, what we got was the typical, it's the PPP's fault because they've been in charge of sin for so long, or, oh, don't worry about it. It's actually just rich people complaining about not having electricity. And sort of the discussion went somewhere else. And with the locusts, for instance, a national emergency was declared. A full-on national emergency was declared. And those things are rare because that's one of the things that Climate Action had asked for, was the invocation of a national emergency that would suspend certain fundamental rights, the rights to trade, industry, and profession, for example, to make restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions and pollutions and things. But a full-on sort of emergency was declared, and yet the discourse we get out of it is one of lack of coordination between the Ministry of Food Security and the provinces, and the fantastic news that the World Bank has given us money essentially to buy pesticides and double, what are they called, cabins, these automobiles, so that people from Islamabad can drive around in Sindh. So it seems that these discourses are stolen by regular news cycles, or the way we the way we understand things, and there might be opportunities as well. So Sarah, can I ask you to make a final comment while we wind up this session?
Okay, I think everybody said pretty much everything of any importance that could have been said. I would, though, like to say that I love this question that you posed to Rimal about human rights and climate change, and I would love to come over and discuss it with you in some detail, because I know you are the best person
I think
to
we should
answer
do
it.
another discussion like this, the four of us, just on this. I'm sorry, Jinnah Institute, but you're not invited.
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Absolutely. But my personal opinion, though, is as far as human rights and climate change is concerned, I don't know, and I hope I'm wrong, I don't think it has the impact in Pakistan that you would want it to have. I think we've had such a bad record of human rights violations that whether we pitch smog as a violation of the right to life, or we pitch climate change as a violation of your right to food and health and life, I think it just falls flat on its face, the whole thing. And I'm sure you are better equipped to comment on it later, Rafi. But as far as the rest of the conversation went, I would like to add. I'd like to conclude by saying there is no real link between COVID and climate change. It shouldn't be pushed. It shouldn't be pressurized. Policies for both should be distinct. Pandemics end. They have ended. We have seen many in history, and they have ended. The last time climate change became this bad, the planet ended, we all died. So there's a huge difference. And other than that, what's really important is, and the question that we did spend some time on, the raising of awareness for climate change policies to be successful, the need for some data, plenty of grassroots level data that should be collected from various parts of the country, and one that is not sort of standard. You don't sit in Islamabad and expect that you can look at what's happening in Kenya and post that in Pakistan. It's not how climate change works. Climate change is very localized. Lastly, I'll say that if what it will take for the government to take climate change seriously is preserving the economy or saving the economy while combating climate change, then they should engage people. They should engage people from Climate Action Pakistan who are willing to help them come up with policies. They should engage experts who are willing to help them come up with policies that will bridge the divide between economic growth and combating climate change. And there is absolutely no way the government can dodge it just by planting trees on this bridge. Yeah.
Thank you. Imran?
Yeah, I think Sarah's covered most of it. Rimal's discussed a lot of it as well. So in terms of moving forward, I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact that we're already too late. This is, sitting in Islamabad, we like to talk about this COP or that COP or the NDCs and the National Adaptation Plan and the National Action Plan and this or that and the climate change policy and the water policy. And that's all good and well, but the fact of the matter is, no matter what we do from now, climate change is here to stay, and it's already impacting us, and that thing needs to be re-emphasized again and again at as many forums as we can. It just needs to. We need to bring that home for the decision makers, because people are already being affected by food security. So initially we talked about how perhaps the terminology that we use does not resonate with the individuals in the field and people who earn their living, for example, from growing crops. But when you go out into the field, you realize that they know more about the changing climate and the changing weather patterns than we do as researchers sitting here. Yes, they might not know the terminology, but it's impacting them, all the same, and they have a better understanding of it. So again, the second thing that I want to emphasize is to do as much research as we can, and at this time we're really lacking on that front. What we are doing is we focus more on these policies and plans and this notion of governance that does not resonate with the individuals that are being impacted by what we do here in Islamabad. So that's my last point. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. I see you're our pessimist in the group. Let me now turn to Rimal and ask you for some final thoughts.
I think so this can be both a pessimistic and an optimistic thought, which is that, unfortunately, I think the climate crisis discourse sort of suffers from, the boy who cried disaster. And it's really, but what makes me hopeful is, when I look at what happened with the smog crisis last year, when I see how people responded to COVID, I think when the problem is at your doorstep, people do act. But unfortunately, as Imran Saab said, it's here to stay. It's here. It's been showing the worst of itself for many years now. So I think more, as everybody has said, when the data is available, when the research is done, I cannot emphasize the importance of putting it in everybody's face as much as you possibly can. Yes, there is this level of fatigue that Pakistan suffers from when it comes to this crisis and that crisis, and it's ingrained this fatalism within us, that the likes of which I don't think I've ever seen anywhere else. But I think it's really important that investments within the environmental community is made in communication. During our foray into this, it really became clear that this is something that is not, because I suppose the resources are so focused on, and rightly so, on the data collection, that there's not much left over from already very limited resources that are going into this. So it's really, really important that we figure out a way, not only develop that regional vocabulary, but just a basic vocabulary that's a lot, that makes all these problems and this really rich data that's being put together understandable to people who might not know enough about it.
Rafa, you're on mute.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for telling me that I'm on mute. We're slightly over an hour, so let me wind up. But I want to conclude by telling a story that Danish Mustafa told me about when he was doing field research in Sindh for his PhD. He said he was in the field and this farmer sort of wandered over to him to ask which NGO he worked for. Because in those days, if you wore a pant and shirt in a village in Sindh, it was assumed you were either a government servant or an NGO worker. So Danish, dutifully explained to him that he was actually an academic and who was doing research on canal water supplies to see what power structures existed between the head of a canal and the tail of a canal. And the farmer stood there listening to him patiently and then said, "Acha, iske liye bhi PhD dete." Which just goes to show that no matter how much we need to have localized information about policymakers, people know this stuff already. Just a question of going out and listening to them. And with that, I'll draw this to a conclusion. I'll thank you all for your time. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your inputs. I've been furiously taking notes, which will form part of some of the submissions that come out of this. And I'll let you know when this report is out. And I'll also share with you whatever publicity Jinnah Institute has for this. So you may want to share that with your circles, as they say. So thank you, guys. And let's soon have a meeting like this, climate action, and discuss that HR issue.
Thank you, Rafi.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Take care, guys.